Hey folks, Zach Osterman, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star, with another one of these, video updates. Still trying to dig my way into this and figure out what works, what doesn't. Feel free to kind of comment or maybe send an email, zach.osterman@indystar.com, if there's stuff you'd like to see, if there's stuff you like about the format, don't like about the format. We are very much an open book with regard to how this is going to work. The primary purpose today is something I'm going to start doing before every football game, which is three things that I'll be watching, just kind of little blurbs, I guess, little hits. We're also going to talk about basketball recruiting, but to talk about Indiana State tonight, 7:30, and we're recording on Friday around lunchtime. Indiana opened, I think, somewhere between a 30 and a 31-point favorite, not surprising. Indiana State lost 27-0 at home to Eastern Illinois in its home opener. Last week, I think that was on a Friday as well, so Indiana State has at least had one more day of rest and preparation than IU has. But still, I think a game Indiana should win and win comfortably. And so you want to be careful not to draw too many conclusions from a game like this in some of the same ways you are careful not to maybe set anything in stone from a game like Ohio State. But I think three things I'll be watching tonight. Number one is offensive play calling. I do expect Indiana to stay basically about as vanilla as it can. I think Indiana stayed pretty straightforward, pretty base against Ohio State. Number one, not to overwhelm two young quarterbacks, but number two, possibly to maybe hold some stuff back on film with games like Louisville and Maryland, coming up just later this month. And I think Indiana's going to try and do that again tonight. Probably in an even more pronounced way, because if you're Indiana, you're hopeful that just your base stuff, your base calls, your most sort of straightforward offense is going to be enough to move the ball and score points against Indiana State. But I will be interested in particular to see, does Indiana in the Ohio State game rushed the ball 33 times, only passed it 21. Do we see a similar balance? And does it feel like, at least as much as we can infer anything from this game coming up tonight, does it feel like that's more about just kind of making the game as efficient as possible, putting as little on film as possible, or is that maybe more about buying into a certain style and using Indiana State as an opportunity to fine-tune some of the things that we saw around option concepts, triple option, things like that, before Indiana really tries to break it out in a big way against Louisville next weekend? Number two folds into number one, which is quarterback play, and not just who plays well. Does one player clearly shine above the other? In talking about Taven Jackson, who will start, and Brendan Sorsby, who will play, at least according to the stated plan from Tom Allen. But is there one that we feel like we can sort of directly say, maybe not just across Indiana State, but Ohio State and Indiana State, one that do we have a sense of what Indiana sort of wants to lay into the ground as its offensive philosophy this year? And two, does one of those two guys clearly look more comfortable with it than the other? I've said this before. I know other people have too. It does feel a little bit like this is going to be about fitting a quarterback to a system rather than a system to a quarterback. And you're always that's always a sliding scale for an offensive coordinator. You're always sort of trying to get the mountain and Muhammad to meet somewhere in the middle between the players you have and the scheme you want to run, and how to find what maybe brings out the best in those players within that scheme. It does feel like Indiana could wind up in a position, for a variety of reasons, where the scheme is really kind of dominates that conversation this year, and the quarterback decision is much more about who fits that better, who just looks more comfortable, more confident, more poised, more decisive. And that's not just in the pass game, but certainly in the run game, certainly in the option game, things like that. And so I'll be watching that tonight again, as much as we can infer from this game how kind of those two things fold in to one another. And then the third thing I would mention would be pass defense. It was very good for Indiana against Ohio State. Now, some of that may be Ohio State being a little bit vanilla in that game, not trying to overwhelm its own starting quarterback, its new starting tackles. But I mean, not only allowing 237 passing yards to an offense that routinely breaks 300 in Ryan Day's tenure, holding Marvin Harrison to 2 catches for 18 yards. He was really a non-factor. The only player that really got loose on Indiana was Cade Stover, who had 98 yards on 5 catches, the tight end, Ohio State's tight end, and 49 of those 98 yards came in one place. That was kind of one bust, rather than it was maybe all day Stover really, really exposing some sort of hole in Indiana's pass defense. Indiana State, as a team, threw 4 interceptions against Eastern Illinois. 2 different quarterbacks had 2 picks. Can this defense, which really held its own, earned a lot of credit, probably encouraged a lot of people, not least its coaches from the Ohio State game, show up and do that against a lesser opponent? Because, it's one of the oldest cliches in sports, but it's not just sort of how you play when you're punching up, when you're the underdog, when your blood's up because you're playing a really, really good team, but can you be consistent in it against a team that you should have a lot of the sort of physical and athletic and depth advantages over? And I look at that secondary in particular because I think we all could see in the preseason the defensive line looked good. You understood there was at least a veteran presence at linebacker with players like Aaron Casey and Jacob Mangum-Farrar. The big question mark was that secondary. This is an Indiana State team that seems like it could be vulnerable if that front 4, front 5 can get some push and some pressure to making mistakes that Indiana should be able to capitalize on. Do we see that unfold? Is that how we see the game play out? Because I think this is kind of a game where if you're Indiana and you want to feel good coming out the other side of it, it's not just about performance, but about consistency from Ohio State and feeling like you're sort of stacking good performances on top of one another heading into a crucial period in your schedule. So those are the 3 things I'll be watching. We also should touch on basketball recruiting briefly. Curtis Givens, Derek Queen, Liam McNeely, all expected in Bloomington this weekend, all 3 of them teammates from Montverde Academy in Florida. Of course, Indiana's had a lot of success in recent years. Jalen Hood-Schifino and Malik Renew, both from Montverde. Indiana also took a walk-on from Montverde that's on the roster right now that for this coming season. I think, forgive me, just got an email. That's Outlook chiming on me. That's how the sausage is made, I suppose. I think the big thing for Indiana, and I've said this whenever anyone has asked, is it really does feel like we could have seen even a year ago how much Indiana felt like it was going to prioritize 2024 in a way that maybe it wasn't going to prioritize 2023 in high school recruiting. Not that Indiana didn't recruit anybody in 2023, and I think Indiana felt really good about the players that it signed in 2023, Gabe Cupps and Ja'Kai Newton, but you didn't see nearly as much investment in the 2023 class as you see now in the 2024 class in terms of time and energy and momentum and things like that. And that's despite the fact that a year ago today, we could have sat here and talked about the offseason upcoming for Indiana and said, no matter what happens in Mike Woodson's second season, you're going to lose, as many as 4 starters, maybe even all 5. There's going to be transfers and different things like that. We knew last offseason, or this offseason that is now starting, sort of winding to its conclusion, we knew that it would be an offseason of real roster turnover for Indiana. And yet Indiana didn't seem to want to address that before the fact in high school recruiting in the way that it seems to want to really, really dig its teeth into 2024. And listen, Indiana's had a lot of success in 2024. It's landed in some really good players, Final 3 schools, Final 5 schools, Final 7 schools. These 3 players coming this weekend, and certainly McNeely and Queen in particular, have been on the radar for quite a while. I think Givens picked up his offer back in the spring, but Queen and McNeely both visited Indiana together last year as well on their junior year official visit. Now they're repeating the process with their senior year official. It's not necessarily going to be easy to get any one of these guys. Givens' recruitment until recently seemed to be sort of bending more south. I believe he's from Memphis originally, and it seemed to kind of be, sort of taking on a flavor of maybe he was going to wind up staying somewhere in the South. McNeely is really probably as high on Indiana's list as anybody in this class, but he's also visited Kansas recently, and he's expected to visit Texas, which is his in-state school. He's from Texas, although he plays, obviously, at Montverde in Florida. So Indiana's going to have some tough competition there. And then Queen also visited Kansas recently, I believe with McNeely, and is about to or is also considered, not considered, he is strongly linked to Maryland. He's from Baltimore, and his ties to that program to Maryland go back a long, long way. Of course, it's his in-state school. There are some mitigating factors there. I think Maryland's primary recruiting sort of point person in its pursuit of Derek Queen is Tony Skinn is now a head coach. So, maybe Maryland has had to sort of juggle some things with that relationship. But I would be surprised if the Terrapins just sort of disappeared in his recruitment. Indiana's kind of in the, very much sort of the put up or shut up moment, I think, is starting to arrive for Indiana in 2024. We've seen the impressive work Mike Woodson and his staff have done in, getting in with some of these guys and really sort of building strong relationships and getting these guys to a place where Indiana's among their final schools, Indiana's among their leaders, among their favorites. But you got to close. And on the one hand, if you don't, then you just kind of had then it feels all a little bit like a vanity exercise. Like you spend a lot of time recruiting high-level prospects that decided they had no interest in your program, and you wind up having to, sort of rip up a lot of your plans and start over and probably do another really heavy portal hit in the spring. On the other, it does feel like Indiana's maybe on the precipice a little bit, and if it could get one of these players to commit, whether it's one of the three coming in this weekend, whether it's a Boogie Fland, who I expect to set up an official visit to Indiana at some point next month based on what I've heard, whether it's a player like Anner Boateng or anyone like that, it feels like if you could get one, then it's not hard to see a path to one or two more, maybe even three more following along. Recruiting can gain that kind of momentum before. We've certainly seen it in Indiana, and we've obviously seen it other places as well. But it does feel like that first commit is going to be really important. Will one come out of this weekend? Again, this is just a lot of this is just sort of what you hear on the wind. I don't think there's anything necessarily pointing in that direction right now. But let's get to Saturday. Let's get to Sunday. And let's kind of see maybe what the landscape looks like then, because Indiana has invested a lot of time in some of these guys. And I do think it's possible, though I'm not sitting here and predicting it by any means, that Indiana could get to a place where maybe one of them is ready to commit, if not this weekend, then fairly soon. But please understand that is not a prediction, and I don't want to say a name because I don't want anybody to say that that I sort of predicted somebody was going to pop when they didn't. This is not me putting in a crystal ball. It's just me trying to read the tea leaves as best I can. Either way, it is a very big weekend for basketball recruiting for Mike Woodson and his staff, and it's going to be fascinating to see kind of what these guys say, coming out the other side of it, and how that maybe frames a lot of what's left in 2024 for Indiana. So we'll wrap it there. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe these videos. We'll have more of them through football season, through basketball season. We're going to try and make this a regular thing, and we'll talk to you soon.